June 26, 1943. 28,000 feet above northern France, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson felt the first 20mm cannon shell strike his P-47C Thunderbolt before he heard it. The impact travelled through the airframe like thunder through bone, then another. And another. The cockpit exploded inward in a cascade of plexiglass fragments and scorching metal. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his face, burning his eyes. A machine gun bullet creased the tip of his nose. Shrapnel from a cannon shell peppered his right leg. The massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine ahead of him caught fire. For a terrifying moment, Johnson watched flames stream past his shattered canopy. He reached for the canopy release, desperate to bail out. The mechanism refused to move. Cannon damage had jammed it partially open, just 6 inches, not enough space for him to squeeze through with his parachute. He was trapped inside a burning fighter, half blind from hydraulic fluid, 28,000 feet above enemy territory. Then something unexpected happened. The fire went out, not gradually, but suddenly, as if someone had turned off a switch. The engine continued running despite absorbing direct hits from German 20mm cannons. Johnson blinked hydraulic fluid from his swollen eyes and checked his instruments through the oil-smeared windscreen. Fuel pressure held steady. Oil pressure held steady. The massive radial engine continued its characteristic rumble, seemingly unconcerned that it had just been shot full of holes. What Johnson experienced in those terrifying seconds would become a defining characteristic of American fighter design, one that German pilots and engineers would struggle to understand throughout the war. His fuel tanks, riddled with bullet holes and cannon strikes, had sealed themselves. The fuel that should have been streaming from dozens of punctures, creating a vapor cloud that would transform his fighter into an airborne bomb at the first spark, remained contained. The Germans had never seen anything like it. This is the story of a technology so simple it seemed almost primitive, yet so effective it would fundamentally alter the air war over Europe. It begins not with Johnson's miraculous survival, but with a question German fighter pilots asked themselves with increasing frustration throughout 1943 and 44. Why won't these American fighters burn? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The concept of the self-sealing fuel tank was not new when the United States entered World War II. George Murdoch had applied for a patent on self-sealing fuel tank technology as early as February 7, 1917, during the First World War. The Federal Trade Commission had temporarily blocked publication of his invention to maintain secrecy, but by August 9, 1921, Murdoch received United States Patent No. 1,386,791 for his self-puncture sealing covering for fuel containers. But there is an enormous difference between a laboratory concept and a production technology that can be manufactured by the millions, installed in combat aircraft operating under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and function reliably when a pilot's life depends on it. That transformation required American industrial capacity and engineering sophistication that Germany would spend years trying to understand. By 1940, as war consumed Europe, the United States Naval Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia, began systematic testing of fuel tank designs submitted by the 4 largest rubber manufacturers in America: Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, B.F. Goodrich Company, Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, and United States Rubber Company all committed massive resources to developing self-sealing technology. Each company attacked the problem from slightly different angles, testing various rubber compounds, layer configurations, and manufacturing processes. The fundamental principle was elegantly simple. A self-sealing fuel tank consisted of multiple layers of rubber material sandwiched together. The inner layer, in direct contact with gasoline, was vulcanized rubber that would not react chemically to petroleum-based fuel. The outer layer was untreated natural rubber. When a bullet or shell fragment punctured both layers, fuel began seeping through the hole. The moment untreated natural rubber contacted gasoline, a chemical reaction occurred. The rubber absorbed the fuel and swelled dramatically, expanding into the puncture and physically blocking it. The process took seconds. But the engineering challenges were formidable. Early Navy prototypes failed catastrophically during testing. When bullets struck fuel tanks at combat speeds, the impact created hydrodynamic shock waves that traveled through the liquid fuel faster than the speed of sound in air. These pressure waves, generated by bullets moving at 2,000 feet per second or more, could generate pressures exceeding 10,000 pounds per square inch for microseconds. Initial prototype tanks literally exploded from the inside, their back walls blown completely out by the hydrodynamic ram effect. Navy engineers and rubber company researchers persisted through hundreds of failed tests. They learned that the thickness of each rubber layer mattered enormously. Too thin, and the self-sealing action couldn't generate sufficient material to plug the hole. Too thick, and the added weight became prohibitive. And worse, the reduced internal volume meant less fuel capacity in already space-constrained aircraft. They discovered that the untreated rubber layer needed specific chemical properties to react properly with the aromatic compounds in aviation gasoline without dissolving or becoming brittle over time. They found that the layers needed to be held in precise position relative to each other, typically encased within the metal fuel tank structure or the aircraft's wing structure itself. They determined that seams, the joints where sections of rubber were connected, created weak points that could catastrophically fail. Minimizing seams became a manufacturing priority that required developing entirely new production techniques. By late 1941, the American rubber industry had solved these problems. Ernst Ager of United States Rubber Company patented his self-sealing fuel tank design in 1941. Goodyear chemist James Merrill filed his patent the same year for a refined two-layer system. His design would eventually be installed in Goodyear-produced F-4U Corsair fighters and hundreds of other aircraft types. Elmo Hansen, lead chemist for Firestone, filed a comprehensive patent on January 21, 1941, that would be granted as United States Patent No. 2,404,766. These were not competing designs fighting for market share. They were parallel solutions to the same problem, developed simultaneously under intense pressure as war approached. The United States military needed self-sealing fuel tanks in quantities that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. American industry delivered them by the millions. When Republic Aviation designed the P-47 Thunderbolt, self-sealing fuel tanks were specified as standard equipment from the beginning, not an upgrade, not an option for certain variants. Standard equipment on every single aircraft. The P-47B, the initial production model that entered United States Army Air Force's service in November 1942, carried 307 United States gallons of fuel in self-sealing tanks. The P-47C, the model Robert Johnson flew on that June day in 1943, maintained the same capacity. Later, P-47D models increased internal capacity to 370 United States gallons, all in self-sealing tanks. But capacity numbers don't convey the physical reality of what this meant. The self-sealing material lining each fuel tank was approximately 1 inch thick or more in most applications. This might not sound significant until you consider that fuel tanks in fighter aircraft are precisely shaped containers, fitting into wings and fuselage sections with extremely tight tolerances. Reducing the internal dimensions by 1 inch in every direction dramatically reduced total volume. To achieve 307 gallons of usable fuel capacity with self-sealing tanks meant that the metal tank structure itself had to be correspondingly larger than it would be without self-sealing material. This meant more weight in the structure, more weight in the rubber lining, and more space dedicated to fuel storage rather than other equipment. The P-47 design accommodated this through sheer size. At 17,500 pounds maximum takeoff weight, the Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. Much of that weight was protection. Armor for the pilot, structural redundancy for battle damage survival, and self-sealing fuel tanks. German engineers understood the theoretical benefits of self-sealing tanks. They had experimented with similar technologies. The Dornier Do-17 bomber used self-sealing tanks during the Battle of Britain, consisting of alternating layers of vulcanized and non-vulcanized rubber, approximately 1 centimeter thick, with a leather outer layer to contain the rubber compounds. German fighters incorporated varying degrees of fuel tank protection depending on the model and production date, but German implementation consistently lagged behind American production in scale, effectiveness, and universality. Material shortages forced compromises. Strategic prioritization of other systems meant self-sealing. Tanks were often specified but not actually installed in production aircraft. Quality control degraded as the war progressed, and Germany's industrial capacity came under relentless attack. By 1943, when German pilots began encountering American Thunderbolts in significant numbers, the difference in fuel system protection became painfully, lethally obvious. Obersten-Lieutenant Heinz Baer, third highest-scoring German ace with 220 victories, would describe his encounters with P-47 seconds in post-war interviews with frustration that bordered on disbelief. "We could hit them repeatedly with our cannon," he explained. "We could see our rounds striking, fuel streaming from their wings initially, but the pilot never fell. The Thunderbolt pilot could sit there absorbing our fire, waiting for his moment to return fire." What Baer and other German pilots were witnessing was self-sealing technology, functioning exactly as designed under combat conditions. A 20mm cannon shell, striking a P-47's wing, would punch through the aluminum skin, pass through structural members, and penetrate the fuel tank. For perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, gasoline would spray from the entry and exit holes. During those seconds, if the pilot was very unlucky, a tracer round or incendiary bullet might ignite the fuel vapor, but within seconds, the self-sealing rubber lining would swell, physically plugging the holes. The fuel spray would stop. If fire had started, it would extinguish itself, as oxygen inside the tank was consumed and no fresh fuel emerged to sustain combustion. German pilots trained on aircraft where fuel tank hits frequently meant catastrophic fire had no framework for understanding this. In Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds or Focke-Wulf Fw 190 seconds, a fuel tank hit typically resulted in immediate fuel streaming, rapid fire development, and the pilot's desperate attempt to bail out before the aircraft exploded. The psychological conditioning was absolute. Fuel tank hit equals death. Watching American fighters take fuel tank hits and continue flying violated everything German pilots understood about aerial combat. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical protection the technology provided. Robert Johnson's experience on June 26, 1943, became legendary precisely because it demonstrated the extremes of punishment the P-47 with its self-sealing tanks could absorb. After the initial attack that damaged his aircraft so severely, Johnson struggled to control the crippled fighter. His vision was compromised by hydraulic fluid burns. His canopy was shattered. Control surfaces responded sluggishly. But the engine continued running, and critically, his fuel system remained intact despite multiple penetrations. Then a single Focke-Wulf Fw 190 appeared behind him. The German pilot, likely Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful pilots with over 100 victories, closed in to finish the straggler. Meyer had expended his 20mm ammunition destroying B-17 bombers earlier in the mission, but his twin 7.92mm machine guns still functioned. He made pass after pass, each time raking Johnson's Thunderbolt with accurate fire. Johnson could do nothing except slow his aircraft to just above stall speed and slew it left and right, making himself as difficult a target as possible while flying blind. Ground crews would later count more than 200 7.92mm bullet strikes on the aircraft, in addition to 21 direct 20mm cannon hits from the initial attack. The fuel tanks absorbed dozens of hits. They sealed. Johnson's P-47 continued flying. According to Johnson's account, verified by his wingman who caught up moments later, Meyer eventually pulled alongside the battered Thunderbolt, close enough for Johnson to see him clearly through his damaged canopy. The German pilot looked at the devastated American fighter, still somehow airborne, then waggled his wings in salute and turned back toward France. Whether Mayer had exhausted his ammunition or simply recognized the futility of continuing the attack against an aircraft that refused to die, he broke off. Johnson nursed his crippled Thunderbolt across the English Channel. He made it to Royal Air Force Manston in Kent, barely able to see the runway. His landing gear functioned despite the damage. He touched down and rolled to a stop. Ground crews examined the aircraft in stunned silence. The damage was so extensive that the P-47 was declared beyond economical repair and used for spare parts. But Johnson walked away with relatively minor injuries. He returned to combat 5 days later. The significance of Johnson's survival extended far beyond one pilot's extraordinary luck. The 56 Fighter Group's operations officer, Major David Schilling, immediately recognized that the P-47's survivability, particularly its fuel system protection, fundamentally changed combat doctrine. Reports filed throughout the summer of 1943 documented a tactical revolution happening in real time. American pilots could withstand punishment that would destroy any other fighter. This wasn't theoretical. This was being demonstrated daily over occupied Europe. P-47 pilots could pursue attacks longer, press home deflection shots that required flying through enemy defensive fire, and most critically, protect bombers by staying in combat rather than breaking off to avoid battle damage that would force other fighters to disengage. The Thunderbolt didn't just survive battle damage, it allowed American pilots to fight differently, more aggressively, with less concern about the consequences of absorbing enemy fire during an attack run. This psychological freedom translated into tactical effectiveness that German fighter commanders quickly identified as a serious problem. Luftwaffe tactical directives from late 1943, recovered after the war from German archives, reveal growing concern about engaging P-47 seconds. Fighter wings issued instructions emphasizing the need to achieve kills on the first attack pass. Pilots were explicitly warned not to assume visible strikes meant the aircraft was finished, not to assume fire or smoke indicated imminent destruction, and not to remain in combat with damaged Thunderbolts that might still be fully capable of fighting. These warnings represented a fundamental admission. The Luftwaffe's best pilots, flying aircraft they believed technically superior, were being advised to avoid extended combat with American fighters because the Americans simply would not die when shot. The fuel system protection was only one element of P-47 survivability, but it was perhaps the most critical. Structural damage could be catastrophic, but modern fighters were remarkably resilient to bullet and shell fragment damage in non-critical areas. Control system damage could be compensated for through pilot skill and redundant systems. Even engine damage could often be managed, particularly in the P-47's robust radial engine, where individual cylinders could be destroyed without complete power loss. But fuel system damage traditionally ended fights immediately. A fighter streaming fuel had minutes at most before either fuel exhaustion forced an emergency landing or fire consumed the aircraft. Self-sealing tanks transformed fuel hits from immediate death sentences into survivable damage that the pilot could fight through or use to escape and return to base. German intelligence officers, analyzing combat reports from mid-1943 onward, noted patterns that troubled them deeply. American fighters, particularly P-47 seconds, were returning to base with battle damage that included confirmed fuel tank penetrations. Photographs taken by German fighter pilots during combat, later recovered from captured Luftwaffe facilities, showed American fighters, with visible fuel streaming from wing hits. Yet those same aircraft appeared in subsequent combat missions days later, patched and returned to service. The Americans had somehow solved a problem that Germany had addressed only partially and inconsistently. They had made their fighters' fuel systems resistant not just to small arms fire but to cannon strikes, and they had implemented this protection universally across their fighter fleet without accepting crippling performance penalties. By autumn 1943, as the strategic bombing campaign intensified and American fighter groups grew in number and experience, the cumulative effect of P-47 survivability became strategically significant. German fighter wings, under desperate pressure to stop Allied bomber formations, found themselves expending ammunition at unsustainable rates, trying to down American escorts that absorbed damage and kept flying. A typical engagement might see a German fighter pilot attack a P-47, observe multiple strikes including fuel tank hits, assume the American was finished, and break off to engage another target, only to discover minutes later that the supposedly crippled Thunderbolt was still fighting. The ammunition expenditure required to definitively destroy a P-47 was significantly higher than for any other Allied fighter type. This meant German pilots either had to focus overwhelming fire on single targets, leaving other American fighters free to engage, or spread their fire across multiple targets, achieving visible damage but few actual kills. The mathematics of ammunition expenditure quickly became unsustainable. Focke-Wulf 4 190 seconds typically carried 200 rounds per 20mm cannon and 1,000 rounds per machine gun. A combat sortie might encounter multiple American fighters, expending most or all ammunition on a single P-47 that still might not go down, left the German pilot defenseless against other threats, and forced return to base without engaging the bombers, defeating the entire purpose of the mission. General Major Adolf Galland, commander of all German fighter forces from November 1941 to January 1945, issued directives in October 1943 ordering pilots to ignore American fighters and focus exclusively on bombers. The theory was that bombers represented the actual threat, fighters were merely escorts, and destroying the bombers would end the strategic campaign. This directive failed catastrophically because it ignored the reality that German fighters had to fly through American fighter screens to reach bombers, and those American fighters, freed from defensive concerns by their aircraft's survivability, became even more aggressive in preventing German attacks. The technological gap, represented by self-sealing fuel tanks, was part of a broader industrial disparity that Germany confronted with increasing desperation as the war progressed. American industry didn't just develop advanced technologies, it implemented them as standard production equipment on every aircraft, in quantities that overwhelmed German production capacity. The rubber required for self-sealing fuel tanks came from American rubber manufacturers whose production capacity exceeded Germany's entire rubber industry. The specialized compounds, the manufacturing precision, the quality control systems necessary to produce millions of self-sealing tank liners that would function reliably in combat conditions, all reflected an industrial capability that Germany could not match given strategic material shortages and progressive degradation of manufacturing standards under Allied bombing. By December 1943, German technical services received detailed reports on captured P-47 seconds that had been brought to the Rechlin testing facility for evaluation. German engineers meticulously documented every aspect of the aircraft's design, including the fuel system. Their reports noted, with professional objectivity, that the self-sealing tank implementation represented a level of engineering, sophistication, and manufacturing quality that exceeded current German capacity to replicate in production quantities. The materials, the precision manufacturing, the consistent quality control required to produce such systems reliably at scale simply exceeded what German industry could achieve given the constraints it faced. This knowledge, carefully documented and professionally reported, couldn't change the fundamental reality. Understanding American capabilities didn't grant Germany the resources to match them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The winter of 1943 to 44 brought the most intense period of air combat in the European theatre. Germany's aircraft industry operated under relentless Allied bombing. Luftwaffe fighter strength, despite desperate production efforts, was being eroded by attrition. Experienced German pilots were being killed faster than training programs could replace them. The P-47 groups, meanwhile, were growing stronger both in numbers and tactical proficiency. New American pilots arriving in England received training that explicitly emphasized the P-47's survivability characteristics, including self-sealing fuel tanks, as core advantages to exploit tactically. Instructors told students directly, "Your aircraft can take damage that would destroy anything else. Use that advantage. Press your attacks. The Thunderbolt will get you home." This confidence, built on documented combat experience rather than propaganda, manifested in increasingly aggressive American tactics. P-47 formations would engage German fighters in situations where other Allied fighters would have disengaged to avoid damage. They could pursue attacks through defensive fire because pilots knew fuel tank hits, the most common cause of combat losses in previous wars, were survivable. First Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, epitomized this aggressive philosophy. Gabreski, son of Polish immigrants with personal motivation to fight the Nazi occupation of his ancestral homeland, flew every mission as if it were personal vengeance. His tactics exploited the P-47's strengths perfectly, including its ability to absorb battle damage. He would identify German fighters attacking bombers, dive on them from altitude, withstand their defensive fire if they turned to engage, then destroy them with concentrated fire at close range. Between August 1943 and July 1944, Gabreski would shoot down 28 German aircraft, making him the top American ace in Europe at that time. His survival through hundreds of combat missions, many seeing his aircraft damaged, some including confirmed fuel tank hits that sealed successfully, became legendary among both American and German pilots. The spring of 1944 brought Operation Argument, the Big Week campaign designed to destroy German fighter production. Between February 20th and 25th, combined American and British forces launched the most intensive air offensive yet mounted. The 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force in Italy flew approximately 3,800 heavy bomber sorties. Royal Air Force Bomber Command added over 2,800 night sorties. Approximately 10,000 tons of bombs struck German aircraft factories. P-47 groups bore significant responsibility for daylight fighter escort duties during Big Week. The campaign resulted in over 500 German fighters destroyed in aerial combat. P-47 loss rates remained under 1% per sortie despite intense combat. German pilots forced to defend their factories and airfields had no choice but to engage, despite knowing that the American escorts could absorb damage and continue fighting. After-action reports from German units following Big Week revealed growing demoralization specifically related to engaging P-47 seconds. Pilots described hitting thunderbolts repeatedly, observing fuel streaming from wing hits, assuming successful attacks, only to watch the same aircraft continue combat. Some German pilots began requesting transfers to other fronts. Others developed convenient mechanical problems that kept them grounded. The Luftwaffe's personnel office investigated and discovered widespread reluctance to fly against American formations, with captured documents specifically citing encounters with P-47 seconds as a factor. The psychological dimension of fighting an enemy whose aircraft simply wouldn't die when shot proved as significant as the physical protection the technology provided. German pilots lost confidence. They stopped pressing attacks. They disengaged earlier than tactical doctrine advised. They avoided combat when possible. The entire tactical posture of the Luftwaffe changed in response to aircraft that remained functional despite battle damage that should have been catastrophic. The summer of 1944 brought the P-47 into an expanded role in ground attack missions, supporting the Allied advance after D-Day. The Thunderbolt's survivability made it ideal for low-altitude attacks, where ground fire posed constant threat. Self-sealing fuel tanks proved as effective against ground-based anti-aircraft fire as they had against aerial combat damage. Throughout June and July 1944, P-47 groups flew thousands of ground attack sorties. German ground forces came to dread the characteristic sound of the P-47's Pratt & Whitney radial engine at low altitude. They called it Jabo, short for jagged bomber or fighter bomber, but the term carried fear rather than simple description. The massive American fighter could fly through intense anti-aircraft fire, deliver bombs and rockets, strafe ground targets with its 8 machine guns, and return home with battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Second Lieutenant Robert Harmon, flying with the 362nd Fighter Group, was attacking German positions near Saint-Lô on July 25, 1944, when multiple 37mm anti-aircraft shells struck his aircraft. One shell destroyed his right-wing tip, removing several feet of structure. Another penetrated his engine, destroying 2 cylinders and briefly setting the engine on fire. A third struck his tail, severing elevator control cables. Harman managed to extinguish the fire using engine shutdown and restart procedures. He regained partial control using trim tabs alone, compensating for the severed cables. Most critically, despite obvious fuel tank damage indicated by brief fuel streaming that quickly stopped, his self-sealing tanks functioned as designed. He flew his crippled aircraft 150 miles back to his base in England on an engine running on 16 of 18 cylinders. The aircraft was declared beyond repair and used for spare parts, but Harman walked away without serious injury. He would fly 89 more combat missions before war's end. These incidents, documented in official records and pilot accounts, were not exceptional. They were routine. The P-47's combination of structural strength, redundant systems, comprehensive armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks created a survivability envelope unprecedented in fighter design. The self-sealing tanks specifically addressed what had historically been the most common fatal damage in aerial combat. German anti-aircraft crews equipped with 20mm, 37mm, and 88mm guns discovered that bringing down a P-47 required far more hits than any other Allied aircraft. Standard anti-aircraft doctrine assumed 2 or 3 20mm hits would destroy a fighter. Against P-47 seconds, crews reported needing 10 or more direct hits, and even then, the aircraft often made it back to Allied territory. Fuel tank hits that would have immediately downed any Luftwaffe fighter were survivable damage in the Thunderbolt. The P-47's radial engine added another dimension of survivability that complemented the self-sealing tanks. Unlike inline engines with vulnerable cooling systems where a single coolant line hit caused rapid failure, the radial could lose entire cylinders and continue running. American pilots reported flying home on engines missing 3 or 4 cylinders, still producing enough power to maintain altitude. Combined with fuel systems that sealed themselves after battle damage, the survivability became almost absurd by the standards of previous air warfare. In the Pacific theater, where the P-47 served with distinction from 1943 through war's end, the ruggedness proved equally valuable. The long-range P-47 Newtons variant with its 556-gallon internal fuel capacity, all in self-sealing tanks, escorted B-29 Superfortress bombers on raids against Japan. The aircraft's ability to absorb battle damage from both Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire was as crucial in the Pacific as it had been in Europe. The comparison with Japanese fighters became especially stark. Japanese aircraft designers, constrained by less powerful engines and prioritizing range and maneuverability, typically omitted both armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to save weight. The Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's most famous fighter, lacked both protections. The consequences were catastrophic. American pilots discovered that even brief bursts of 50-caliber machine gun fire into a Zero's fuel tanks frequently resulted in immediate catastrophic fires and explosions. Combat reports from the Pacific documented this lethality repeatedly. Zero pilots who survived being shot down described how fuel tank hits meant almost certain death. The aircraft would be flying normally one moment, then completely engulfed in flames the next, with no opportunity for the pilot to bail out. American pilots' gun camera footage showed Zeros exploding so quickly after fuel tank hits that the transformation from functional aircraft to fireball took less than 2 seconds. Veteran Zero pilot Takao Tanimizu explained after the war, "You could always tell if it was a Zero or enemy plane that had crashed in the sea. The Zero left almost no debris. It burned completely." This horrific vulnerability resulted directly from the absence of self-sealing fuel tanks. The weight savings that allowed the Zero its legendary range and maneuverability came at a terrible cost in pilot lives. The American decision to accept the weight penalties of self-sealing tanks, along with pilot armor and robust structure, reflected a fundamentally different design philosophy. Japanese and German designers optimized for performance parameters they could measure: speed, rate of climb, maneuverability, range. American designers optimized for a parameter that was harder to quantify, but ultimately more important: pilot survival. An experienced pilot in a less maneuverable but more survivable aircraft would, over time, defeat novices in high-performance aircraft. More importantly, The survivable aircraft would produce more experienced pilots, because those pilots lived long enough to gain combat experience. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side whose pilots survived their early mistakes and grew into dangerous veterans. By the war's end in May 1945, the statistical evidence overwhelmingly supported this philosophy. Over 15,683 P-47 seconds were built during the war. They flew 546,000 combat sorties in the European and Mediterranean theatres. They were credited with destroying approximately 3,750 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, plus roughly 3,000 more on the ground. But most significantly, the P-47's loss rate per sortie was the lowest of any American fighter in the European theatre. 0.7%. For every 1,000 sorties flown, only 7 P-47 seconds were lost to all causes, including operational accidents, mechanical failures, and combat damage. By comparison, the P-38 Lightning lost 13 per 1,000 sorties. The P-51 Mustang lost 9 per 1,000. The P-47's survivability translated directly into pilot survival. Of American aviators who served in Europe, those flying P-47 seconds had the highest survival rate of any fighter pilots. This wasn't statistical noise. It represented thousands of young men who returned home to their families instead of dying over Germany. The engineering decisions that made the P-47 tough, including the universal implementation of self-sealing fuel tanks, were also humanitarian decisions, though the engineers probably never framed them that way. German aces interviewed after the war uniformly expressed respect for the Thunderbolt's survivability, specifically mentioning fuel tank protection. When aviation historians asked General Lieutenant Adolf Galland what Allied aircraft he most respected, his answer was immediate. The P-47 Thunderbolt. Not because it was the best fighter aerodynamically. The P-51 was faster and more maneuverable, but the Thunderbolt was nearly unkillable. You could hit it, and it would keep coming. That was psychological defeat, knowing that your best shots might not be enough. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, a 176 victory ace who survived the war despite being shot down multiple times, provided perhaps the most eloquent assessment in his 1970 memoir. We learned to respect all our opponents, but we feared the P-47 specifically. It represented American industrial might in tangible form. We flew graceful, efficient, deadly machines. They flew armoured fortresses, and in the end, their fortresses defeated our thoroughbreds, because wars are won by survivors, not by dead heroes, no matter how skilled or brave. The technical assessment by German engineers who examined captured P-47 seconds documented this respect in professional terms. Their reports noted that the self-sealing fuel tank implementation, along with other survivability features, reflected engineering priorities fundamentally different from German practice. The Americans had designed for survivability above elegance, for protection above minimum weight, for redundancy above efficiency. And operationally, this philosophy proved devastatingly effective. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined thousands of combat reports, damage assessments, and aircraft recovery records. Their findings quantified what German pilots had experienced. The P-47 consistently required far more ammunition expenditure to destroy than other Allied fighter types. A typical engagement that might down a Spitfire or P-38 with 50 to 75 cannon rounds might require 200 or more rounds to destroy a P-47. For German fighters with limited ammunition capacity, this difference was strategically significant. The self-sealing fuel tanks specifically contributed to this resilience in measurable ways. Analysis of P-47 seconds that returned with battle damage showed that fuel tank penetrations represented a large percentage of hits sustained, yet fuel system failures resulting in loss of the aircraft were relatively rare. The self-sealing technology was functioning as designed under actual combat conditions, preventing fuel loss that would have forced emergency landings or created fire hazards. The legacy of self-sealing fuel tank technology extended far beyond World War II. Every American fighter developed subsequently incorporated self-sealing fuel systems as standard equipment. The F-86 Sabre, F-100 Super Sabre, F-4 Phantom, all featured self-sealing fuel systems derived from wartime research. The technology evolved, with improved rubber compounds, better manufacturing processes, and eventually foam-filled tanks that divided fuel spaces into thousands of small cells to prevent vapor detonation. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Even modern military aircraft continue to use self-sealing fuel systems. The specifications have changed. Tanks now must withstand 50 caliber bullets as a minimum, 20mm autocannon as a design goal, and increasingly, fuel systems include fire suppression systems using inert gas to eliminate oxygen from tank spaces. But the requirement exists because the lesson learned in World War II remains valid. Fuel system vulnerability kills pilots, and protecting fuel systems saves lives. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, named explicitly in honor of the P-47, carries forward the same design philosophy. The A-10's fuel systems are designed to survive battle damage. Self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant fuel feed systems, and foam-filled tank spaces all reflect lessons learned when Robert Johnson flew his shot-up P-47 home, despite fuel tank damage that should have killed him. The human dimension of this technology's impact cannot be reduced to statistics, though the statistics tell an important story. The P-47 pilots who survived the war because self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires or fuel exhaustion went on to live full lives. They married, raised children, built careers, grew old with their families. The technology gave them that opportunity. Robert Johnson, the pilot whose June 1943 survival became legendary, returned to the United States in May 1944 after completing his combat tour with 27 aerial victories. He had become the first United States fighter pilot in Europe to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills. He spent the rest of the war training new pilots, emphasizing aggressive tactics enabled by the P-47's survivability. After the war, Johnson lived until December 1998, reaching the age of 78. He spent decades speaking to veterans groups and schools, educating young people about the war and honoring those who didn't return. The self-sealing fuel tanks that kept him alive that June day gave him 55 years he wouldn't have had otherwise. Francis Gabreski, who became the top American ace in Europe with 28 confirmed victories, survived the war and continued serving in the United States Air Force. He flew combat missions again during the Korean War, adding 6.5 more victories to his total. He retired as a colonel in 1967 and lived until January 2002, reaching 82 years of age. The P-47's protection, including its self-sealing tanks, had given him a lifetime. Major David Schilling, who recognized the tactical implications of P-47 survivability and documented them in reports throughout 1943, survived 91 combat missions and was credited with 22.5 aerial victories. He continued serving after the war, becoming a test pilot and advocate for jet fighter development. His insights on survivability versus pure performance influenced post-war fighter design. He died in 1956 in a car accident in England while still on active duty, but he had lived to see the principles he documented in those 1943 reports become standard doctrine in American fighter design. These men, and thousands of others who flew P-47 seconds and survived damage that would have killed pilots in other aircraft, owed their survival to a chain of decisions and developments that began in American industrial laboratories in the late 1930s. Rubber company chemists experimenting with compounds, Navy engineers persisting through failed prototypes, Republic aviation designers specifying self-sealing tanks as non-negotiable standard equipment, factory workers manufacturing millions of fuel tank liners to precise specifications, mechanics installing and maintaining the systems under field conditions, the entire industrial system working together to keep pilots alive. The German response to encountering this technology reveals how industrial disparities manifested in combat effectiveness. German pilots and engineers understood perfectly well what self-sealing fuel tanks were and how they functioned. German aircraft used similar technology in varying implementations. But German industry could not produce self-sealing tanks of consistent quality and quantities sufficient to equip every fighter as standard equipment, while simultaneously meeting all the other demands of total war. Material shortages forced compromises. Strategic rubber supplies were inadequate for universal application. Manufacturing capacity was diverted to other priorities. Quality control degraded as factories were bombed and skilled workers were replaced by forced labor or conscripted into military service. The gap between understanding a technology and implementing it at scale widened progressively as the war continued. By late 1944, German fighter production actually increased despite Allied bombing, reaching approximately 4,000 aircraft per month. But these fighters were increasingly built with substitute materials, simplified manufacturing processes, and reduced quality control. Self-sealing fuel tanks, when installed at all, often used inferior materials that didn't seal effectively or that degraded quickly. Some late-war German fighters were delivered without self-sealing tanks despite specifications calling for them, because the materials simply weren't available. American P-47 pilots flying against these late-war German fighters noted that by 1945, German aircraft seemed to catch fire more easily than earlier in the war. This observation aligned with intelligence reports indicating degraded German fuel system protection. The industrial attrition that had ground down German manufacturing capability manifested in reduced survivability for German pilots, even as their aircraft's raw performance sometimes improved through desperate engineering innovations. The final major air battle of the European theatre, Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, demonstrated the cumulative effect of these disparities. The Luftwaffe launched over 850 fighters in coordinated strikes against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The operation achieved some initial success, destroying hundreds of Allied aircraft on the ground. But as Allied fighters scrambled and engaged the German raiders, the results were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. By evening, the Luftwaffe had lost 271 aircraft destroyed with 143 pilots killed or missing. Critically, the dead included 3 Geschwaderkommodore, 5 Gruppenkommodore, and 14 Staffelkapitane, the experienced leadership the Luftwaffe could not replace. P-47 groups engaged throughout the day. While some P-47 seconds were destroyed on the ground during initial German strafing attacks, not one P-47 was confirmed lost in air-to-air combat despite being outnumbered in many engagements. German pilots returning from Bodenplatte reported the same frustrating experience they had suffered throughout the war. They would achieve hits on P-47 seconds, observe visible damage including fuel streaming that quickly stopped, yet watch the American fighters continue fighting effectively. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, second highest scoring ace in history with 301 victories, participated in Bodenplatte. In post-war interviews, he described expending his entire ammunition load on one P-47, seeing numerous strikes, yet the aircraft continued until he finally hit a critical component. He noted that with the same ammunition on the Eastern Front, he could have shot down 5 Soviet fighters. This comparison captured the fundamental reality. German pilots weren't less skilled when fighting in the West versus the East. They weren't using inferior weapons or tactics. They were fighting opponents whose aircraft were simply more difficult to destroy, because American industrial capacity had produced protection systems that German industry couldn't match. The final accounting of the P-47's combat record validated the design philosophy that prioritized survivability. Of the 15,683 P-47 seconds built, approximately 3,499 were lost to all causes during the war. This included combat losses, operational accidents, mechanical failures, and ground attack missions where aircraft faced intense anti-aircraft fire. The roughly 1-to-1 ratio of aircraft lost to enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat appears modest, until one considers that from mid-1944 onward, most P-47 seconds served primarily in the ground attack role, rather than pure fighter missions. In the fighter escort role during 1943 and early 1944, when P-47 seconds primarily engaged in air-to-air combat, the exchange ratios were significantly better. During this period, P-47 groups routinely achieved 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 kill ratios, while maintaining lower loss rates than other Allied fighters operating in the same combat environment. The self-sealing fuel tanks contributed directly to these favorable exchange ratios by preventing combat damage from becoming combat losses. The ground attack missions that dominated P-47 operations from the summer of 1944 through war's end subjected the aircraft to hazards that no amount of protection could completely mitigate. Flying at low altitude through concentrated anti-aircraft fire meant accepting battle damage as routine. The question became whether that damage would be survivable. For P-47 seconds, it usually was. Pilots routinely returned from ground attack missions with battle damage that included fuel tank penetrations, engine damage, and structural hits. The self-sealing tanks prevented fuel fires and fuel exhaustion that would have forced emergency landings in enemy territory. The official claims from ground attack missions documented staggering destruction. Over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks destroyed or damaged. While such claims inevitably included some duplication and overcounting, the scale of destruction was undeniable and had measurable impact on German military operations. The P-47's ability to survive while conducting these dangerous low-altitude attacks depended heavily on its survivability features, including self-sealing fuel tanks. German ground forces testimony after the war confirmed the P-47's effectiveness and their fear of it. The characteristic sound of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine at low altitude became associated with impending destruction. German soldiers described feeling helpless against attacks they could do little to prevent, despite heavy anti-aircraft defenses. The knowledge that hitting these aircraft didn't reliably bring them down added to the psychological impact. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany itself, the air war had effectively ended. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed not through inferior equipment or tactics, though both played roles, but through systematic attrition that Germany could not sustain against opponents with overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority. The self-sealing fuel tank, a single technology among many, represented the broader industrial disparity that determined the war's outcome. The question of whether self-sealing fuel tanks were worth their cost in weight and reduced fuel capacity was answered definitively by combat experience. American pilots overwhelmingly preferred aircraft with self-sealing tanks despite the performance penalties. German pilots who survived to sea captured American aircraft examined firsthand wished desperately that their own fighters had equivalent protection. The lives saved vastly outweighed any tactical disadvantages the technology imposed. The broader lesson extended beyond self-sealing tanks to the entire philosophy of aircraft design. The Americans had approached fighter design by asking, what does a pilot need to survive combat, complete the mission, and return home? The answer included heavy armament, robust structure, pilot armor, redundant systems, and protected fuel systems. The resulting aircraft was large, heavy, and less agile than theoretically possible, but it was also far more likely to bring the pilot home alive. German designers had asked a different question: what performance is necessary to defeat enemy aircraft in combat? The answer emphasized speed, rate of climb, maneuverability, and firepower. The resulting aircraft were often technically superior in measurable performance parameters, but German pilots died at higher rates than their American counterparts, and the cumulative loss of experienced pilots degraded overall Luftwaffe effectiveness more than any individual technological advantage could compensate for. The mathematical reality of attrition warfare favored the side that kept pilots alive. A pilot who survived 10 missions was far more effective than a novice. A pilot who survived 50 missions was extraordinarily dangerous. A pilot who survived 100 missions was an ace who could train others. Self-sealing fuel tanks helped create survivors, and survivors won the air war. The post-war interviews with German aces reveal a consistent acknowledgement of this reality. These men, who had been among the most skilled fighter pilots in the world, who had achieved victory totals that seem almost impossible, admitted that skill and courage weren't enough against an opponent who could absorb punishment and keep fighting. Oberstleutnant Heinz Baer's comment that the P-47 had to be handled very carefully reflected professional recognition that the usual tactics didn't work against aircraft designed to survive rather than to perform. The legacy of self-sealing fuel tanks in the P-47 Thunderbolt thus extends beyond World War II aviation history into broader questions about engineering philosophy, industrial capacity, and the human cost of war. The technology saved lives measurably and demonstrably. Those saved lives had ripple effects that continue to the present day. The children and grandchildren of P-47 pilots who survived fuel tank hits exist because rubber company chemists developed the right compounds, because Navy engineers persisted through failed prototypes, because Republic Aviation specified protection as standard equipment, because American industry produced the systems by the millions, and because mechanics maintained them under field conditions. Robert Johnson, standing on the wing of his shot-up P-47 at RAF Manston on June 26, 1943, looking at the 200-plus bullet holes and 21 cannon strikes his aircraft had absorbed, represented a moment of technological validation. The self-sealing fuel tanks had functioned exactly as designed under the most extreme combat conditions imaginable. They had prevented fuel loss that would have meant death. They had given him the chance to fly home. German pilots, watching American fighters absorb fuel tank hits and continue fighting, experienced the inverse. Technological frustration. Their training, their experience, their weapon systems, all told them that fuel tank hits meant victory. The reality that American fighters had somehow negated this fundamental combat truth through industrial application of advanced materials and manufacturing processes represented a paradigm shift they struggled to process. The psychological impact of this frustration cascaded through the Luftwaffe. Pilots lost confidence in their ability to down American fighters. They became more cautious, more defensive, less willing to press attacks. This behavioral change, driven by the empirical experience of shooting American fighters that wouldn't die, degraded overall combat effectiveness as significantly as physical losses did. By war's end, the lesson was clear to both sides. The Americans had built fighters designed for survivability first, performance second. The Germans had built fighters designed for performance first, survivability second. In sustained combat between industrial powers, the survivability-first approach produced better results because it created more experienced pilots, maintained unit cohesion longer, and sustained morale more effectively. The self-sealing fuel tank stood as a physical manifestation of this philosophical difference. It was not elegant, it was not efficient by weight optimization standards. It reduced fuel capacity and added manufacturing complexity. But it saved lives, and in a war of attrition lasting years, saving lives mattered more than any performance metric. The story of the P-47's self-sealing fuel tanks is ultimately a story about choices. American industry chose to invest resources in protection systems. American designers chose to accept weight penalties for survivability. American commanders chose to equip every fighter with the best protection available, rather than creating elite units with advanced equipment while accepting losses in standard units. German industry faced different constraints and made different choices, not always voluntarily, often forced by material shortages and competing priorities. The results spoke for themselves. American fighter pilots had higher survival rates. American tactical flexibility increased as pilots learned they could fight aggressively without accepting unacceptable casualties. American numerical advantages compounded as pilots survived to become veterans who trained the next generation. The cumulative effect of these advantages, built on foundations that included seemingly mundane technologies like self-sealing fuel tanks, determined the war's outcome in the air. When veterans gathered at reunions in the decades after the war, American P-47 pilots consistently credited their aircraft's toughness for their survival. Many had stories of battle damage that should have killed them but didn't, fuel tank hits that sealed, engines that kept running with cylinders destroyed, structural damage that was patched and flown again. The stories validated the design philosophy that had created the aircraft they flew. German veterans at these same reunions, when present, acknowledged freely that American equipment had been superior in ways that mattered. Not necessarily faster or more maneuverable, though late-war American fighters matched or exceeded German performance in most regimes, but more survivable, more reliable, more maintainable, and produced in quantities that made individual technical advantages irrelevant. The self-sealing fuel tank represents one thread in a larger tapestry of industrial warfare, but it's a significant thread, one that saved thousands of lives directly and influenced aerial combat tactics, fighter design philosophy, and post-war military aviation development for generations. The technology that kept Robert Johnson's P-47 flying after absorbing fuel tank damage on June 26, 1943, was still keeping pilots alive in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts 7 decades later. The fundamental principle that fuel system protection saves lives, and that saving lives is worth significant cost in weight, complexity, and reduced performance, remains as valid today as it was in 1943. Modern self-sealing fuel systems use advanced materials and sophisticated designs, but they trace their lineage directly back to the rubber-lined tanks in World War II fighters. The German pilots who poured cannon fire into P-47 seconds and watched them continue flying learned a far lesson they couldn't unlearn. American industrial capacity, applied through competent engineering to create practical protection systems, implemented universally, created a lethality disparity that no amount of individual skill could overcome. The best German pilots, flying the best German aircraft, using the best German tactics, still lost the air war because their opponents simply wouldn't die when shot. That is the ultimate significance of self-sealing fuel tanks in the P-47 Thunderbolt. Not that they were technologically revolutionary, though the manufacturing quality and universal implementation were impressive. Not that they made the P-47 invulnerable, which it certainly wasn't, but that they fundamentally altered the mathematics of aerial combat by transforming what should have been fatal damage into survivable damage that pilots could fight through or use to escape. The fuel streaming from wing hits in Robert Johnson's P-47 stopped flowing within seconds as the rubber compounds swelled and sealed the punctures. Those seconds, that simple chemical reaction of rubber absorbing gasoline and expanding, gave Johnson the chance to nurse his crippled fighter across the English Channel. That chance became a landing at RAF Manston. That landing became 5 more days of recovery. That recovery became a return to combat. That return became 27 victory credits and survival through a complete combat tour. That survival became 55 years of life after the war. Multiply Robert Johnson's story by thousands of similar incidents, some as dramatic, most less so, all resulting in pilots who lived rather than died because their fuel systems sealed themselves after battle damage. The cumulative effect of these survivals shaped the air war's outcome as significantly as any single technological breakthrough or tactical innovation. German engineers examining captured P-47 seconds at Rechlin understood all of this intellectually. Their reports documented it professionally. They measured the rubber compound layers precisely. They tested the sealing function under controlled conditions. They calculated the weight penalties and capacity reductions. They assessed the manufacturing complexity and material requirements. Their analysis was thorough, accurate, and ultimately futile. Understanding how American self-sealing fuel tanks worked didn't provide Germany with the rubber, the manufacturing capacity, the quality control systems, or the strategic materials to produce equivalent systems in sufficient quantities. Knowledge without resources couldn't change outcomes. The German engineers' reports thus documented not just American technological achievement but German industrial insufficiency. The reports sit in archives now, yellowed paper covered in precise German technical terminology, describing in detail a technology that helped defeat the nation that analyzed it so thoroughly. They represent one of history's ironies. The defeated side sometimes understands the victor's advantages more clearly than the victor does, precisely because analyzing those advantages becomes essential to understanding defeat. The self-sealing fuel tank in the P-47 Thunderbolt was never the most glamorous technology of World War II. It lacked the dramatic appeal of jet engines, radar-directed fire control, or proximity-fused shells. It was rubber and chemical compounds, installed in fuel tanks where pilots couldn't see it, functioning automatically without any pilot input when damaged. It made no sound. It produced no spectacular effects. It simply worked, quietly and reliably, thousands of times across millions of combat flight hours. But those quiet, reliable performances saved lives. The pilots who benefited rarely knew when the system had activated during combat. A fuel tank hit might be noted from brief fuel smell or visible misting, then nothing. The pilot would continue fighting or escaping, land safely, and only during post-flight inspection would ground crews discover the sealed bullet holes in the fuel tanks. The technology worked so well it was almost invisible to the people it protected. German pilots, however, saw its effects clearly. They saw fuel streaming from American fighters, then stopping. They saw aircraft they'd hit successfully in fuel tanks continuing to fight. They expended ammunition at unsustainable rates, trying to achieve the kills that should have come easily. They learned to fear a technology they couldn't see but whose effects they couldn't escape. That fear, that frustration, that growing recognition that American fighters had protection their aircraft lacked, degraded Luftwaffe morale and combat effectiveness as surely as physical losses did. The psychological warfare was unintentional, a side effect of engineering competence and industrial capacity, but it was real nonetheless. By May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the disparity between American and German fighter survivability was absolute. American fighters routinely absorbed damage that would instantly destroy German equivalents. The self-sealing fuel tanks were one element of this survivability, working in concert with armor, redundant systems, and robust structures, but they were a critical element because fuel system vulnerability had historically been the most common cause of combat losses. The final assessment belongs to the pilots themselves. American P-47 pilots trusted their aircraft to bring them home. That trust, built on demonstrated performance rather than hope, allowed aggressive tactics that won the air war. German pilots lost trust in their ability to defeat American fighters. That lost trust, built on frustrating combat experience, forced defensive tactics that lost the air war. The difference between those outcomes traces back through many factors: strategic, industrial, tactical, and technological. But one thread running through all of them is the simple reality that American fighters, particularly P-47s, had self-sealing fuel tanks that worked reliably, and German fighters increasingly didn't. That difference saved American lives, cost German lives, and helped determine history's course. Robert Johnson, kissing the ground when he climbed out of his shot-up P-47 at RAF Manston, didn't know the chemical composition of the self-sealing compound that had kept fuel in his tanks. He didn't know the names of the Goodyear or Firestone chemists who had developed it. He didn't know the manufacturing processes used to produce it. He just knew it had worked when his life depended on it. That was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.